Hurly burly, 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 WAZOO, WAZOO, WAZOO.
All right, that's our theme song by my good friend Ray Martini, which I love because it's catchy and also because you just can't beat that message discipline. Ray had one name and one word to work with. And God damn it, we got our money's worth. Welcome to another two-part podcast on the Herle Burly. For part one today, we have Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. The National Chief is originally from Little Black Bear First Nation, and he's brought his skill and focus on measurable progress to all levels of First Nations governance over a more than 30-year career. He was first elected National Chief in 2014, was re-elected in 2018, and announced just last December that he would not seek re-election this summer. We're going to talk about Indigenous issues and priorities in this country, what he achieved in the job, and what the agenda should be going forward. Part two is our ever-lovin, ever-cussin political panel with Jenni, Byrne, and Scott Reid. The two of them have comms and strategy experience up the WAZOO, except if they were describing it themselves, they would never use a word as gentle as WAZOO. Together, we're going to try to untangle the government's new travel restrictions for Canadians. Let me see, how does this work? I can't travel to the Caribbean, but I can go to Florida or Arizona as long as I quarantine in a hotel when I get back. But I won't be able to get back home from Mexico unless, of course, I fly to Florida first, then hop on another plane back to Canada from there. And that's just the start of it, Herle Burlyites. After that, we'll continue our conversation on vaccines, specifically this week, the lack thereof. We'll talk about the PMO's issues management problems with our public health agency, plus Annamie Paul, our Hey Yous this week, and a question from our listener mailbag. National Chief Bellegarde, I want to welcome you to the Herle Burly. How are you?
I'm fine, and thanks so much for inviting me to your great show, David. Really honored to be here.
Oh, well, it's my honor to have you. You're very distinguished, and plus you're from Saskatchewan, like I am. So, you know, we got that going for us. How are you doing? I ask everybody who comes on the show because I think it's a very strange time for people, and everybody's had to adjust their lives a lot. How are you overall?
I'm doing fine. This COVID-19, people have to stay in their bubble, and my wife and I and my son here, we're in our bubble here in Ottawa, and being healthy and making sure that you're balanced mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So we try to get out and go skating, or whether it be on the canal now, or they got a great oval over here down in Old Ottawa South. So just getting out. So we're doing all right.
Right. And physical activity is a pretty important part of that for you.
Oh, no question. I still play at our age. We don't call it old timers hockey anymore. We call it senior pro. And but that's,
we used to call it the beer leagues, didn't we? Used to call it the beer leagues.
Yeah, I don't drink, but yeah, it's old. I'll call it senior pro, the old timers. But that's put on hold now. And so just getting out and something physical. I urge everybody to make sure they find a balance somehow to get out of the house, even though we're told to stay home. That's the message. But you've got to get out and get some fresh air and find the balance. That's what it's all about.
Right. Are you as excited about the Montreal Canadiens as I am?
Well, Montreal Canadiens are good. Back home on Black Bear, we used to watch Saturday night and hockey night in Canada, and somehow I grew up liking Toronto Maple Leafs, and so Toronto
in Fort Capel. That's not allowed in Fort Capel.
Well, George Armstrong just passed away, so I had a day of mourning as well. George Armstrong was one of the greatest. He had Aboriginal. In the hockey league, we had Freddie Sisakamoose as well, the First Nations from Atakakoop, that played for Chicago Blackhawks. So between Toronto and Chicago, I favor. But Montreal's good too because they got Carey Price. Carey Price is a net, and good First Nations goaltender. There you go.
It's going to be them, or it's going to be the Habs or Toronto in the Canadian division this year. It's going to be a great season to watch.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. Like I always tell people, I like Toronto, but I'm not a diehard Toronto fan. it's not like we are with Saskatchewan Roughriders. Like you got to bleed green and wear green no matter where you live in Canada. And that's important.
I'm so afraid there's not going to be a season this year for the Saskatchewan Roughriders or for the CFL, and I don't know that the league can sustain 2 years off. I don't want a single fewer dollars to go to Indigenous purposes, but I do hope the government finds a little bit of money to get the CFL playing this summer.
I think that would be a wise move. Like the CFL has had a huge impact on the country, and I think it's not all provinces have NHL teams. But you can say every province got a CFL team. So I think there should be some light there at the end of the tunnel. I would hope that the policy and decision makers look at that.
Yeah, me too. All right, let's get to the meat of this. You are the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
Let's assume that the people listening to this podcast don't know what the Assembly of First Nations is or does. So can you tell us what that organization does and is, and what the role of national chief is?
Sure, I'd be happy, David. Like in Canada, this is going to be your First Nations 101, like in 3 minutes. So in Canada, there's 634 First Nations Indian Act bands right across Canada. So there's 634 chiefs. Okay. So there's 203 in British Columbia. There's 47 in Alberta. There's 74 in Saskatchewan. There's 66 in Manitoba. There's 134 in Ontario. There's 47 in La Belle Province de Quebec, 47 First Nations in Quebec. There's 13 in Nova Scotia, 15 in New Brunswick, 2 in PEI, 2 in Newfoundland, 14 in the Yukon, and 28 in the Northwest Territories. So about 634 First Nations. Each of those reserves elects a chief. So they have a chief, right? They elect a spokesperson or a chief. 634 chiefs.
Yep.
Those 600 chiefs come together and form a collective across Canada called the Assembly of First Nations. They formed this organization, the National Indian Brotherhood, and now it's evolved into the Assembly of First Nations. And every 3 years, those chiefs come together to elect a national chief. And you have to get 60% of the vote from those chiefs in order to become a national chief. So that's how I'm elected, by the 600 chiefs, in every 3 years. And so my next election is in July of 2021. But I said I'm not letting my name stand for re-election. So there will be a new national chief come July. And the role of national chief is basically we're advocates. We advocate for inherent rights, for treaty rights. But basically we advocate and lobby for policy and legislative change. And we also advocate for major investments in every federal budget every year. Because as First Nations people, there's a huge gap that needs to be closed in Canada. And there's got to be continued investments in education and housing and water and infrastructure and healthcare, policing as essential service, all these things. So I've learned my role that you got to influence first the throne speech, which outlines the federal government's priorities and objectives for their term. So when we've got a whole chapter dedicated to First Nations people. And then after the throne speech, you begin the process of influencing the federal budgeting cycle. So the Minister of Finance, it used to be Bill Morneau. Now it's Chrystia Freeland. I call her Sunia Ogimao. Sunia Ogimao means big money chief. So she's the big money chief. So I've got to work with Sunia Ogimao to make sure that each of those ministers, for example, Minister Mark Miller gets enough resources in his department to invest in housing and education. I got to make sure she invests enough with Bill Blair so that policing as essential services gets done, Bill Blair. And then ongoing for each 6 or 7 key ministries. And that's what we do. There you go. That's your, and then I could even give it a structure if you want from Little Black Bear. My home first, because I was a chief at Little Black Bear, belongs to a tribal council. Then Little Black Bear entered into Treaty Number 4. So Treaty 4 is another area that gets organized. Little Black Bear is one out of the 74 bands in Saskatchewan that's part of the FSIN, Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. And then Little Black Bear is part of the Assembly of First Nations on the bottom, 634. And then Little Black Bear were part of the Cree Nation. because we speak Cree, ni stamina pik squid neheoan. And we're also Nakota, Homotakia pe Pinamaya. So I speak some Nakota and Cree because we're a Cree mixed tribe and a Assiniboine Nakota mixed tribe. And then Little Back Sign Treaty 4. So that's our structure. So that's how we're part of all these different organizations as one band, as Little Blackbird, where I grew up. So there you go.
How many people in Canada speak an Indigenous language?
Oh, like that's what I always say. We're speaking English now. It's a beautiful, beautiful language. And maintenant, je parle français un petit peu aussi. I speak a little French. So French and English, we're speaking these beautiful languages. But as well, there's over 60 different languages, First Nations languages in Canada. And they're the jewels of this country. They're the national treasures of this country. And so we have over 1 million people. Some of them are on the verge of extinction. So we have all these different nations and tribes right across from East Coast to West Coast. So I won't name them all, but for example, we have the Mi'kmaq out east in Nova Scotia. They're all Mi'kmaq. And then in New Brunswick, there's some Maliseet, the Wolastoqey people. Then you got Mohawks. Then you got Dene. Then you've got Innu. You've got Blackfoot. You've got Cree. You've got in the far north the Dene people. Then the coastal, like in the BC, there's 32 languages in British Columbia. Hulkameelam, Hulkaminam, Squamish. Like there's so many. So, and how many of them speak out of that million? The numbers aren't as strong as they could be. Which is why we focused on and pushed this government to implement Bill C-91, the Indigenous Language Revitalization Bill. That's part of who we are.
Right.
And we don't want our languages to be lost because they're national treasures. And it's also linked to the inherent right to self-government, self-determination, our nationhood, linked to our land and waters and ceremonies. So we need to do more. And to
identity, right?
Exactly.
And to identity.
There's so much languages in our worldview and ceremonies, but again, how do you know that you're a Blackfoot person? How do you know you're Dene? How do you know you're Anishinaabe? How do you know you're Mi'kmaq? It's of course your lineage and your connections to your family, or your community, your nation, your tribe. It's also ceremony, but language is your identity. And I've always said it's linked to the inherent right to self-determination. You need 5 elements. You need your own languages, your own lands, your own laws, your own people, and your own identifiable forms of government. So prior to the Indian Act in 1876, we had all those things, and we still have those things. Challenge for us now is to revitalize our languages, our nationhood, our sovereignty, and move beyond this thing called the Indian Act, which has been in place since 1876. So language is really very important for our survival.
So I did a focus group with Indigenous people a few months ago for a project I've got coming out. A new podcast, and I talked to them about their lives in Canada, and they either had spent their lives trying to pass themselves off as white, or they had terrible stories of discrimination and prejudice that they had faced, and they all had terrible stories from their parents and grandparents about what they had gone through and what they had faced, including the residential schools, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you angry? You don't seem angry to me.
Well, again, anger and hatred, there's a place for them, I guess, but I've always tried to follow our elders' teachings of the 7 teachings: truth, honesty, love, respect, courage, wisdom, and humility. Those are our 7 teachings. And our elders always say, as a human being, you always try to live by those 7 teachings. And so anger and hate is not amongst those teachings. And I think in Canada, yeah, we know there's a lot of racism. There's a lot of discrimination. There's colonization. There's oppression. There's land theft and the resources. And look at the gap that exists in the quality of life. But if you're going to bring about change, you need to build relationships with people based on those 7 teachings and educate them that we're all in this world together and we have to build a better country for our children and grandchildren. And that's what I believe. And I've lived that my whole life since growing up on the reserve. We have to learn from the past, not live in the past. And yes, residential schools was a genocide of our people. There's no question. The killing of children in schools, the tests they did in residential schools, the banning of our languages in schools. It was a genocide. It was a breakdown of your self-identity. And then you throw on sexual abuse and physical abuse and mental abuse. You're not healthy when you come out of those institutions. And yet you're expected to raise a family in a loving, caring way. And you're healthy now when you come out of that. You're not healthy. So we still feel the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools. And we feel the effects of the Indian Act since 1876. Again, your listeners probably don't know what the Indian Act is, but we weren't allowed to leave our reserves without a permit from the Indian Age until 1951. And we weren't allowed to have access to legal counsel until 1951. We couldn't sell our own wood or kill our own cat without a permit from the Indian agent. In fact, the reserve system in Canada was so good, the people in South Africa with apartheid, they mimicked it, for the black people in South Africa.
Oh, okay.
That's how
That's gross.
That is.
That's gross.
So Canada does have a dark history, but we have a shared past, but we have, more importantly now, a shared future. And because we also have a treaty relationship with the Crown, and that treaty relationship was one on peaceful coexistence and mutual respect and sharing the land and resource wealth together. And I've always said, yeah, we can be angry, but what is that going to do? It's just like when you got a flat tire. You can yell and scream at that flat tire. It's not going to change. You got to get down, roll up your sleeves and start changing and making change. And that's the same thing in life. That's the same thing in this country. You got to roll up your sleeves, start making policy change, legislative change, and start building relationships with everybody, with the provinces, the territories, with municipal governments, with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, so that our children and grandchildren can't see and feel and that racism that we see every day in the justice system, in the healthcare system. That's the philosophy. And I know a lot of my relatives, you mentioned how they had to pretend to be white in order to survive. I know my own relatives in university that pretended to be Mexicans. It was easier to be a Mexican than an Indian or First Nations person to survive because of the racism and discrimination. And the view by our relatives that First Nations are less than, or not as smart as, or not worthy of. And that's something that we've just got to get over and educate people that we've got First Nations men and women that are doctors and lawyers, chiefs, leaders, scientists, and we walk in both worlds. And that's a powerful statement.
Why are Canadians so ambivalent?
I don't think it's taught
Canadians
properly,
so ambivalent?
David. It's not taught properly. There's an education awareness process that needs to happen. Like in the school curriculums right across, because the provinces control the school curriculums. So what are they doing to teach from kindergarten to grade 12 all about the residential schools, or the imposition of the Indian Act, or the relationship to treaties? We learn about the Treaty of Ghent, and the Treaty of Versailles, but the Victorian treaties, the number treaties? Do you know the Truro Wampum Treaty or the Treaty of Niagara? All these are basically the history of Canada and how this country was made. And so people should really be aware of them and learn from that history. And they will see that First Nations had a really huge role to play here in Canada when it developed. And I think a lot of Canadians just don't understand their own history. That's what it is. That's why there's ambivalence. There's, they don't know. As everybody I talk to, I didn't know that happened. Did that really happen? Yes, it really happened. It's our lived experience. So that's what I think.
Interesting. Okay. So as you look back on your term, as your 2 terms as National Chief End, what do you feel good about that you've made progress on?
That's a good question, David. And I've been in elected leadership since 1986. I came out of University of Regina with a business admin degree, undergrad degree, and worked 2 years in human resources as a director of human resource development at the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies. And then in 1986, I got elected at the tribal council as a vice chief. And then that set me on a road, vice chief of the tribal council, then tribal council chief.
Politics, it's addictive.
It is.
Politics is addictive, National Chief.
So, and then from there to FSIN chief, and then regional chief for AFN, and now national chief. And so I've been in First Nations politics since '86. And then you always try to say you move things along, and you try to leave the place better than when you took it over. And so when you develop a strong team, and this applies to any institution or any government, together everybody achieves more, and try to leave the place better than when you walked in. And so when I think back to AFN now, I think back to, we moved on C91, the language bill. That's a huge thing, you know, our language revitalization. I feel good about that. More resources needs to be put in place so you can do some long-range strategic planning, you know, so you can have immersion programs, master apprentice models, digitizing the language because some are on the verge of extinction, you know, and we're having services in our language. So there's lots more that can be done there, but that's moving the right way. I feel good about C92.
Jewish people saved Hebrew.
Yeah, exactly. So it can be done.
Jewish people saved Hebrew, so it can be done.
Yeah, sure. So we've got 60 indigenous languages, nations we've got to focus on. So I feel good about that. C92, we have 40,000 First Nations kids in foster care. And so C92 was a way to start looking at prevention as opposed to apprehension for First Nations kids. And the jewel in C92 that I lift up is that First Nations law is paramount. And that's something we've always talked about. There's not only common law and civil law in Canada, there's also First Nations law, natural law, creators law that needs to be respected as well. And so there's some reserves now, First Nations looking at exerting that law. So C92, child welfare, very big bill. We're moving that along. And then I think about the investments that we've had to work with to close that gap, that 6th versus 63rd gap that still exists in Canada. And what I'm referring to was the socioeconomic gap according to the United Nations Human Development Index. Canada was rated 6. But when you apply the same indices to First Nations people, we were 63rd. So 6th versus 63rd. So that's where investments in housing and water and infrastructure, and we had to really advocate in a very strategic manner to make sure that in every federal budget that there was adequate resources. And so I'm going to say it's not 1, not 2, not 5 Kelowna Accords, $27 billion over 6 fiscal years. That's unprecedented. And so I feel good about that. But I say this too, David, is that progress doesn't mean parity. And I'm going to say that again. Progress does not mean parity. So we've still got a way to go to make sure that that gap is closed and the same quality of life is in place for not only, you know, First Nations, but everybody in Canada. So I feel good about those things. And then the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Bill C-15 is introduced for first reading. Let's see if it'll get passed. That is indeed the roadmap to reconciliation. And I think that's important. So moving in the right way, but still lots of work to do. I don't think work will ever, on these files or issues will ever get done. So it's ongoing. But again, movement in the right direction.
Okay. National Chief, we have to pause now for a brief word from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Because I've been around a while, if Herle was a model on a car lot, I'd be politely described as transmission intact, some rust, not certified. But my age just means I remember a lot of weird stuff. Like this. Scream! That, my younger listeners, was the sound of old dial-up internet. We've come a hell of a long way from that sound to what's happening now, 5G. 5G is designed to connect virtually everyone and everything with mind-blowing speed, reliability, and near-endless data capacity. Bandwidth on steroids. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, launched their 5G network in 2020 and is now live in more than 76 communities across Canada. TELUS 5G will offer so much more technological capacity and opportunity for Canadians, and here's among the most important. Connectivity for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities is set to explode with 5G because it's the perfect solution for those vast stretches of land and rough terrain where laying fiber is difficult, slow, and hugely expensive. To get that done, TELUS's partnerships with government become even more crucial. Spectrum needs to be released quickly and efficiently, and then deployed to customers just as quickly. TELUS is committed to all those partnerships and doing the work to make it all happen so that all Canadians can digitally access even greater opportunity through a world-class network. Go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca to learn more. Okay, so picking up on where you left off, I want to take a few of these issues and drill into them just a little bit, at least for my own understanding. Let's start with the UN Declaration. Assume it passes Parliament and becomes the law of the land here. What tangible change would you expect to result from that?
Good question. I would expect that, well, there's supposed to be a national action plan for the implementation of it. There's also the requirement that all policies and laws to get in line with the UN Declaration. So there'll be a policy review and a legislative review. So those are tangible things. The Indian Act as a racist act will be looked at as to be put to the side and something else to replace self-government agreements, modern, maybe a treaty implementation act. So it'll help put pressure on the Crown, to get in line and make sure that there's policy and legislative changes in place. So that's something very, very tangible with it. And as well, there's the doctrines of superiority are referenced. What I'm referring to are the doctrine of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, are illegal racist doctrines. Because how else did the Crown gain title to our lands and territories? Is through those two doctrines. And so it's a recognition of the land and rights and title holders. And I think that's a positive thing. And I also think that with the passing of the UN Declaration Bill, it will create some stability for investment in every province and territory. And you move beyond the duty to consult and accommodate, and you use free, prior, and informed consent from the rights and title holders on any major project. And that will mean further partnerships, further relationships with private and public sector industry companies. And that, to me, makes more sense. You're not going to have lawsuits. You're not going to have blockade. Like, once the rights and title holders are involved on any project, it creates stability for investment. So that's why I say the UN Declaration is a roadmap to reconciliation in Canada. It's an important piece of work to get done.
Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Water.
Yes.
I grew up in a town, Prelate, Saskatchewan, that didn't have running water until 1967. I have vague recollections as a child of having to go to the well in the middle of town and haul water to drink back at the house. But that's 1965, and that was unusual in 1965. You had to live in a village of 300 people. That is still the case for many reserves.
Yep.
That you don't have drinkable running water. Just as a practical matter, how does that happen, and why is it difficult to solve?
Okay.
Like, the government seems to be determined to solve it. They seem to be prepared to spend money at it. And in some cases, they do solve it, but they said they're not going to make the deadline, and there's some 50-some reserves that still don't have drinkable water. I don't understand this logistically. How does this happen?
Well, it's amazing. Like, you grew up, like I grew up the same way. We didn't have running water until the 70s. And same way, hauling water from the well or from the slough and straining it and, boiling it. And wintertime, you melt snow, and that's just the way we lived. And so now in Canada, at one time there was 130 plus boil water advisories on First Nations. Now it is down to 50. So it is progress being made, but there are some challenges as well, in terms of capacity. Your water treatment plant operator, has to be trained, has to be compensated fairly. And sometimes retention is an issue, because I'll give an example on my reserve, Little Black Bear. Well, the water treatment plant operator might make $50,000 a year. But yet, if he goes to the local town at Fort Capella, Bellegarde, they might make more, $75,000 a year. So, you know what I mean? So retention is an issue. So capacity building is an issue. Training is an issue. Infrastructure, adequate infrastructure is an issue being put in place. And so there's a combination of reasons. I believe it is moving in the right direction, and it's a fundamental right, having access to potable water, human right. And so the government is putting
In
enough
Canada,
resources.
who has more clean water than Canada? It's
Exactly.
insane.
But it's like in Ishkonda,
Right.
that had 25 years boil water. So you've just got to have a very, very specific strategy and plan to address that, and it's got to get done. Like this, it's ludicrous in 2021 that there are still boil water advisories in place. And so more needs to be done, greater focus on that, no question. Fundamental human right. And I think, again, moving the right way, not as fast as it should be.
Murdered and missing Indigenous women. What happened? Did that just peter out? Like, what is the result of that? I mean, it's a national disgrace. I presume it continues. There was a tremendous amount of pressure. There was an inquiry. It seemed fraught with difficulty. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out, has there been any resolution of that? Any change? Has there been any change to policing practices?
Well, another good question. This is, again, a huge issue. The lack of implementation on the National Action Plan on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. They came up with over 200 calls to justice that should be implemented. And there still is yet no formal action plan. So we've got to put that in place, because that addresses everything, from policing to education, to more treatment centers, to transportation, to child daycares, like mental wellness center. Like there's a lot of recommendations that can happen to end this tragedy, this human rights violation in Canada. There's too many missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and people don't treat it as a national, international tragedy that it is. And you think of all the reports that have been done in Canada, David, there's been so many. Like, go back to the Penner report, go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, go back to the Truth and Reconciliation, 94 calls to action, and now MMIW, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Dust the reports off, dust the recommendations off, and come up with an implementation plan, an implementation strategy. And that's what governments need to be held to account for. Show me the action plan, and then on MMIW, one of the aspects is policing, and so now there's two things that should be happening, and we've recommended happen in Canada. One, policing as an essential service. Right now, it's just a program, the First Nations Policing Program, and it's cost shared, 52% by the feds, 48% by the provinces. It's just a program, but that can be unilaterally cut, and there's not enough adequate resources there, human or financial or infrastructure. So yeah, we're moving towards essential service legislation. That's one piece, right? So that's positive. But what about the review of the RCMP? Where's the review? You have zero tolerance for excessive use of force policy, the use of body cams, strengthening the Civilian Oversight Committee, so that there's the police not watching police, better training, de-escalation training, cross-cultural misconception training, better recruitment processes, so you weed out the racist people before they become RCMP members. So all of that's another process that has to happen. And then communication on MMIW, most of the times, when a First Nations woman goes missing, there's a lack of communication and there's a lack of respect. There's, she's just gone out on a party, she'll be back. Or, she always does this, give it a few days. And the police don't treat it like it should be. The importance of this, they don't investigate it properly. And then if there's a death, it's, it's just an accidental death or cause of death unknown. And so the coroner is another one that needs to be looked at. So this whole MMIW has to be a greater focus on in terms of action plan. It's a national, international tragedy. And so it's our job at AFN and other chiefs and PTOs to push government to start working with the families and come up with that action plan sooner than later. It's left unfinished, and it's just not acceptable in 2021.
Indigenous women live with a lot of fear, don't they?
Yes. And then where are their supports? They're stuck. Where's their transportation? Where's their, like there were so many things that I've even called I've even said this 3 years ago, like governments don't have to wait for the MMIW report. Like you can make investments in housing. You can make investments in transportation. You can make investments in daycare, you know, and education and training opportunities for First Nations women, and mental health supports, detox, like all that can be done, and you don't need to wait. So I just like to see the action plan again. I'm going to keep coming back to that. Let's develop a national action plan sooner than later, and then we can hold people to account, governments to account for the action that's there or the lack of action. You know, so we have to do more. It's not acceptable.
Out of the blue, I want to ask you a question that, I'll be honest with you, as much as I've tried to understand the perspective, there's one thing I have trouble understanding as a person with my background. Why do Indigenous people want to live on reserves? They don't all, I know, most of them live in cities, but why does anybody want to live on a reserve?
Well, again, good question. And I've been asked this a few times, you know, and I'll begin like this. It's home. It's where I grew up. And it's part of the treaty obligation for the Crown to sustain and maintain those reserves. You know, in Treaty 4, it's 128 acres per individual, 640 per family of 5. And there's federal Crown treaty fiduciary obligations. The honor of the Crown must be respected and maintained. And we're sharing all the rest of the land in Treaty 4 territory, you know, 75,000 square miles with our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters. And then our reservations in Cree is Skunagun. That's how we refer it, like land set aside. Some might even say land leftover land, but land set aside for First Nations people is Skunagun. But it's home. It's where we can maintain our languages, our culture, our ceremonies, our way of life, you know, and then we're only to enjoy our treaty rights living on Little Black Bear. They're supposed to be portable, you know, so portability of rights, you know, that I can hunt, fish, and trap and gather throughout the Treaty 4 territory. You know, so maintaining our reservations is an inherent right. Like we're sharing all the rest of the land, but that's ours, you know, and that's our jurisdiction over that land and territory according to our laws. So there's maintaining that. And then it's just the attachment to the land, like it's home, like Little Black Bear. Like I say, I grew up there, and it's a small First Nations reservation. It didn't have running water for a long, long time.
But I grew up in Prelate. I don't want to live in Prelate.
Yeah, but it's for us. It's home. It's your identity. It's like people's. You know, it's just the attachment to the land, the territory, the water. That's why we want to maintain these. And there's push factors. Why, like half of our people leave the reserves because there's not enough jobs on reserves and there's not enough housing. You know, and so there's push factors, and we get that. But for the listeners out there, like, why do First Nations people, there's so much problems on the reserves? Well, not like that's the intergenerational trauma from the residential schools, you know? And if you want to talk about self-government, self-determination, you have to start looking at economic self-sufficiency, you know, and making sure that there are jobs and making sure there's adequate housing on every reserve so that people will stay and live and abide by their own laws and customs and traditions. And but that's why we're attached. It's a treaty promise. It's a treaty obligation. And you can never forget that. It's as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. That's a quote from our treaty territory, that these treaties will remain in effect. So that's why we maintain these.
Is it the only place, National Chief, that you feel fully at home? Do you feel differently in Regina than you do at Little Black Bear?
Yeah, I feel different. Like I just feel different coming home, you know, when you get out to the land and walk where you hunted, you know, where you set your traps for trapping, where you set your rabbits, like you just feel attached to the land. And that's just, I can't say it any simpler than that. Our attachment to the land. And then the Creator, we always say, gave responsibility to First Nations people. We always talk about rights, but we also have responsibilities. And for us as First Nations people, the biggest responsibility the Creator gave us was to look after the land and waters. That's our job. And so not only on Little Black Bear, but throughout Canada and indeed throughout the world, because look at climate change that's happening now, David. That's a huge issue. If people are thinking about COVID-19 and what's happening through this pandemic, that's going to be small potatoes until we get our head around climate change. And what are we leaving for our children, grandchildren, and the next 7 generations to come? Like the land and the water comes back to that. And First Nations knowledge has to be listened to, not only domestically, but globally.
Interesting. This is the last of these issues I want to unpack, but it's wonderful to have the opportunity to have you address things that have always been on my mind.
Yep.
There's an astonishing number of Indigenous children in social services across the country. Is that an indictment of Indigenous parenting or of government social services departments?
It's an indictment of government social services department. And they had a policy that was based on apprehension of children, not prevention, before any kind of services and supports kicked in. That's the problem. As soon as you apprehend a child, boom, lots of money, lots of resources, a lot of programming. And that's the wrong approach. Focus on developing prevention services so that those children can stay in their home or in their community with their aunties, their uncles, and a safe, healthy, caring, loving home. Like that's the difference. Not just any home, but a safe, healthy, caring, loving home. One that's free from alcohol and drugs, no question. But having 40,000 children in care is just a symptom of what we've endured for the past 500 years. And that was a cultural breakdown of identity, of self, of family, community, and nation. That's what happened through the residential schools. That's what happened through the Indian Act, those two things. Why do you think there's 40,000 children? It's because of the system, but it's because of the intergenerational trauma as well. And so we've got a lot of healing and wellness to get into, no question. And there's got to be other ways than the existing system. The status quo is not acceptable. So I'll urge everybody at all times to start thinking outside the box and doing things differently to make sure that those high costs of keeping First Nations people in jail, high costs of keeping First Nations people on welfare, high costs of keeping 40,000 children in foster care are changed. And that's what the C-92 is all about. Looking at First Nations law and jurisdiction, making sure those kids can be at home with their family, their community, in a loving, caring auntie or uncle's home or their grandmother's home, grandfather's, like that's what's got to happen. And that's why I'm so excited with C-92 passing. There's an opportunity now, and it's not going to happen overnight. People think, oh, well, it's been 1 year already. You have to give it time. It took 500 years to get us this far. Right. It's not going to change overnight.
Right. Hey, can we talk about the Trudeau government for a minute? So I would say that the Prime Minister Trudeau has talked more about and more emphatically and declaratively about the importance of Indigenous issues than any Prime Minister, with the possible exception of Paul, but probably not, with the exception of Paul. And he has in Carolyn Bennett, a minister who cares deeply about this and is a deeply empathetic person. And he has in Mark Miller, a person who has his ear and seems himself deeply committed and competent on the project. And Murray St. Clair said the other day that they've failed. So if they've failed, first of all, how have they failed? And who could succeed if they're failing?
Mm-hmm. Again, Murray St. Clair is one person, and I thank Murray for his opinion. That's his view. They failed. I think things are moving in the right direction, and I've always said that, but progress doesn't mean parity. In the history of Canada, what other prime minister has gone to the United Nations and made this speech to the full United Nations body? And I'm talking about Prime Minister Trudeau when he went a year or so back. I think it was September, a couple of years ago. Very powerful speech to the full United Nations body. Who else has done that? To me, that's not a sign of failure. That's a sign of telling the truth to the world of what Canada has done to First Nations people. He talked about the residential schools. He talked about like it's all about land and resources and how it was stolen from First Nations people in Canada. But he talked about that. He talked about the Indian Act. So so that's coming from the Prime Minister of Canada. That has never happened in the history of Canada from a Prime Minister. So to me, that speaks to, okay, he gets it. So now, then you got to start, okay, so what's changing in terms of policy and legislation in Canada because of that speech? And then you mentioned Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller. Well, Carolyn Bennett, Minister Bennett's in charge of CERNA, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, right? And Minister Mark Miller is in charge of DISC, Department of Indigenous Services Canada. So they broke the one department into two. And so you got to start talking about who's responsible for what. So under CERNA, they're trying to move beyond the Indian Act, right? And get First Nations. So that's where the 90 plus tables are. And everybody's at different levels. People are using it for capacity building. And we've got to move beyond the Indian Act and reconstitute ourselves as nations, because we've always been nations. So it's either by your nation tribe, your language, or by treaty territories, or like the question is, how do you wish to move beyond the Indian Act? Some Indian Act bands are doing it by themselves as small reserves. Some are doing it by treaty areas. Some are doing it by nation. So that's CERNA. So they're trying to move beyond it. And this can't be done in one fell swoop. There's got to be a process. And you've got to go as fast as the people, or you're going to go too fast. So the chiefs and councils got to move as fast as their people. You can't jump ahead of the people. The people are always right and will drive this process. So that's CERNA. And then with Mark Miller, to me, he's saying all the right things. What policy and programs are happening within ISK to promote economic development and education? So they're moving the right direction, but it all comes back to getting to Sunia Ogema, making sure that they get enough resources in their departmental budgets to do things. So again, with great respect to people say that, oh, everybody's failing. I will say it's moving in the right way, but progress doesn't mean parity, and there's still lots to do. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. That's the way I look at it. And this is not going to go away or happen overnight. It's a process. Nobody in Canada, like from First Nations people think, oh, if everybody would just leave and everybody, well, we're 1 million people. Canada's got 38 million people. How do you continue to build relationships and work together and build partnerships to make sure that this country is going to be the best? It's the best in Canada and the world. But build it better so that our children and grandchildren can look at each other with respect and love and kindness and sharing that we're in this together. I'm Cree and I'm First Nations and I'm from Little Black Bear, but hey, I vote now. I voted. So you have embraced that concept of dual citizenship, and because nobody's going anywhere. So you have to embrace that concept of we're brothers and sisters and relatives. And let's create a better future for our children and grandchildren that's free from racism, free from discrimination. Nobody's above anybody. We're all in this together. And so at some point, I want to close off with my worldview. I always say, what's your worldview? I want to come back to that later on when we're closing off.
We will close with your worldview. I'm fascinated to hear it. I know you're not in partisan politics, but it is your job to assess partisan politics. And since I asked you whether the Trudeau government was failing, I want to ask you, in what way do you think things would be different on the policy front for Indigenous people if the Conservatives were the government? If Conservatives were to win the next election, what would change?
Well, again, you'd have to look at their party platforms. And my job as National Chief is to influence all parties and all party platforms to make sure that First Nations issues and priorities are in those party platforms. And so a few years ago, I started off with this Closing the Gap document. And people can Google Closing the Gap document. Very well researched, well written. That was our priorities that we'd like to see. And we gave that to all the parties, Conservatives, Liberals, NDP, Greens, everybody got the Closing the Gap document. And then in this last election, we used the Honoring Promises document. So again, trying to influence all the parties when it comes to First Nations issues, because ultimately, if they deal with these issues, it's not only good for our people, it's good for Canada. That gap closes. So that's not only good for First Nations, it's good for the country. And so influencing the Conservatives, a lot of them will seem like they're more closed-minded. They're not as open. There's a right wing to them. And so there's a risk there, you know, and I always tell people, I'm not anything. I'm not a liberal. I'm not a conservative. I'm not an NDP. I'm not a Green. I'm not anything. I'm First Nations and I'm treaty. And so I've got to influence everybody and anybody that will listen to make sure that their policies that they have in their platform resonate with First Nations people. And so I tell people, look at their platforms, look at their policies. Which ones are more in line with inherent rights and treaty rights and closing the gap and making investments? And that's who you vote for, you know, and that's what I say and I urge. And some are better, have better policy platforms than others, and others still need some work. But again, that's our job, is to influence their policy platforms going forward into any federal government election. And that's my job. You just look at the Conservative platform versus the Liberals versus the NDP and the Greens, and who's more in line. And then you put your X accordingly. There you go.
Well, I don't know now if you would be better at politics or diplomacy, National Chief, because that was a pretty smooth answer to that question. So having said that, I think that Trudeau and Miller and Bennett are people of goodwill and good faith on this issue. Why the hell are they fighting Cindy Blackstock and child welfare in court? Why? What is going on there? Like, what is their motivation in fighting you in court?
Yeah, again, the CHRT ruling, and AFN started that, so they're fighting us. Like, so okay. AFN, Assembly First Nations, is part of that fight too. And it really is sad that there's a judicial review, you know, of the CHRT, and we have a class action suit now, you know, for compensation. So we have to look at the legal process. If we're not getting results, our respect for rights, and we want to end discrimination and race against children, for goodness sakes, David, kids. I know. That's not acceptable. Why they're doing it, you'd have to ask them. You know, like, there's an issue.
What do they say when you ask them? Well, what do they say when you ask them?
It's an issue of portability of defining on reserve, off reserve. You know, it's almost like a jurisdictional piece again. And to me, that shouldn't be an issue. You know, let's just keep working together to end discrimination against children, and that services and programs are there for all children, whether they're on reserve or off reserve. And again, if they've experienced racism and discrimination in the child welfare system, they should be adequately resourced for healing and wellness and compensation, whether they're on reserve or off reserve. So that's what I would say to them. And it's not about limiting liability. It's just basically doing the right thing for kids. You only get one childhood. You only get one. You're only growing as a kid once. And we got to make sure that that childhood is free from racism, discrimination, and that they can be all that they can be. You know, fill their lives with education and training and hope, you know, that things are going to get better. That's where my head goes. And so that's my message to everybody listening and to governments listening. Stop this hurting of children. It's they only get one childhood. Let's make it the best it can be for them. Lovely.
Thank you. All right. We're running out of time, and I do have to ask you about the Governor General. And the reason I want to ask you about the Governor General is this. You have, I mean, there are many people out there right now speculating that it would be very opportune to have a First Nation, an Indigenous person as Governor General of Canada. Symbolic in a hugely positive way. I think these symbols can really, really matter. I again, as part of those focus group that I was talking to you about earlier, for instance, the awareness in the Canadian population of who Viola Desmond is very high because she's on the $10 bill. Mm-hmm. And if she wasn't on the $10 bill, nobody in Canada would know who she was. And so I think symbols matter. My question to you is this. You've referred to this several times. Indigenous Canadians believe that their legal status is based on relationships with the Crown of England. Not the government of Canada, but the Crown of England. So if you were to put an Indigenous person officially as the representative of the Crown in Canada, would there not be enormous expectations from Indigenous people that that would be more than a ceremonial position? That that would be somebody that would be advocating for them with the Crown as regard to their treaty rights?
Again, good question. We have, as I mentioned earlier on, we have a great reverence for the Crown because of our treaty relationship. And that was done, the treaty was consecrated through ceremony. So there's a sanctity of contract, a sanctity of agreement, a sacredness, if you will, to this treaty relationship. In fact, we have songs that still talk about the Queen giving us this flag to flutter in the wind forever. And we're referring to the Union Jack because we have that relationship. And once you have an agreement, to share the land, nothing was given up, but to share as relatives, as family, to mutually benefit. That's something we hang on to. So our relationship with the Crown is very fundamental. And that's why we have, I don't know if you ever see our treaty medallions. The chiefs were given a silver medallion and the 4 headmen were given a bronze medallion. But on that medallion, at the back is Queen Victoria. But on the front of that medallion is a First Nations man shaking hands with the European man, shaking hands. And then the hatchet is buried, representing peace. And then you see the sun and the water and the land, and then big teepees and then small teepees, all on this medallion. So it signifies as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows, that this agreement with the Crown will remain in effect now and for future generations. So the fundamental relation is with the Crown. And so we have a great reverency for the Crown. So in Canada, having a First Nations person in that position is very symbolic. And I've said publicly, I support that. And I think it's an important piece because I've also said that we need more First Nations people in positions of power and influence and authority and even symbolism. First Nations people on the Supreme Court of Canada, First Nations people as more deputy ministers in government, more First Nations people around the cabinet table, more First Nations people around caucus table and the Liberal caucus, the Conservative caucus, the NDP and the Greens caucus. We need more First Nations people as university presidents. In the private sector, more CEOs, more First Nations people on board of directors. And yes, in this case, the symbolism of having a First Nations person sit as representative of the Crown. It's a constitutional monarchy, and it would mean a lot. And think of what that says to young First Nations men and women when they see a First Nations person, in a position of authority, even if it's symbolism, what that does. It's the same thing with Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States. What does that say to young Black people? First, the same thing it'll be said in Canada for First Nations men and women, to see our people in positions of power and authority and symbolism. And you're representing the Crown, but you're also representing Canada to the world. And what a strong statement that'll be. And so, yeah, I'm like the Governor General people say it's symbolic. Sure it is, but it's a very important place to tell people about the history of Canada and how we have a shared history, but more importantly, we have a shared future that's intertwined together. And I think that's why that role is so important to build a better country and keep promoting peace and moving towards a country that's free of discrimination and racism. Canada is made up of many, many different peoples and tribes. And, but through our strength is through our diversity. So I think that position has a role to play. Very important role. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it. And I think what a great opportunity to further reconciliation. What a great opportunity to continue with public service. So it's exciting times.
We often end by asking people to give us a reason to be optimistic. But you are you're going to tell us about what your worldview is, and I have a feeling that's going to make me optimistic. So,
well, yeah, David, our worldview is simple, and as First Nations people, we go to ceremony. I've been going to Sundances for many, many years, and our old people, even when you talk treaty, you begin with ceremony. But we're the two-leggeds, and I don't care if you're black, yellow, red, white or whatever. We're the two-legged tribe of people. We're people. But we always give thanks to our mother, Mother Earth, for the gifts she brings. That's our mother. We also give thanks to Father Sky, our Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun, our relatives, the star people. We also give and acknowledge our relatives, the four-legged ones. And we acknowledge the ones that swim, the ones that fly, the ones that crawl. We acknowledge and give thanks to the male plants, the female plants. And then we also give thanks to acknowledge four grandmother spirits, four very important grandmother spirits that look after the waters, the rainwater, the salt water, fresh water, and then the power of women. When life comes, what happens? Water breaks. So that's all that we acknowledge. And we acknowledge the one that sits in the east, in the south, the west, and north, those grandfathers that sit there and do the Creator's work. We acknowledge them. So that's our worldview, and we give thanks for that every day. And we're the two-leggeds. We're part of that as a family. We're all related. So when we say, to all my relatives, all my relations, we're not just talking about human beings, the two-leggeds. We're acknowledging everything I just described. So we're all in this together. And if we're going to make a difference in Canada or the world, we need to hang on to that worldview. And if we can incorporate that worldview in public sector institutions and private sector institutions, board of governors, you're going to get better policy and better legislation, everything, because we're all family and we're all connected. And that's what we hang on to through ceremony. That's what we hang on to in our reservations, through our sweat lodge ceremonies, through our Sundance ceremonies, through our potlatch ceremonies, through our Mohawks, their winter ceremonies they go through, their turning of the ash, everything. It's all connected. And that's our worldview as First Nations people.
That sounds like a pretty healthy, holistic perspective on humanity's place in the overall scheme of things, and one that's quite sharply different from the approach that those of us who descend from European ancestry tend to have, which is that the earth is here for our enjoyment and we are the only thing that matters on it. And that's probably how we've ended up destroying the planet with climate change. So, National Chief Bellegarde, I want to thank you for your time today. This has been a very thoughtful discussion. I know I put some difficult issues to you, and I don't know very much about them. So I appreciate the patient and thoughtful way that you explained them to me. And, I think that people who listen are going to be a lot better informed as a consequence. So thanks for coming on. And thank you for your service to the country.
Thanks for the opportunity, David, and all the best. And we'll get through COVID-19 together, no question. Vaccines are on the way, but we can't take it for granted. Continue to wash your hands, social distancing, wear your masks, all those good things. And we'll come back stronger at the end of it.
Maybe someday you and I get to watch a Habs Leafs game together.
That would be fun. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Sure. Well, there was some pretty good news in the past couple of weeks for the Greater Toronto Area and for our sponsor, CN. The federal government, after 5 years of hearings and assessments and planning, green-lighted CN's new transfer terminal in Milton, south of Toronto. This is a big deal. The economy in the Golden Horseshoe has been running hot for years. It's the fastest growing market in Canada, which means there's a relentless demand for cargo. There's no question CN has the trains and resources to meet that demand, but the sheer volume of Toronto-bound cargo has been forcing the railway to unload some trains in Montreal and send containers down the 401 in thousands of long-haul trucks. The new Milton Transfer Hub will mean fewer long-haul trucks on the highways and smoother cargo delivery in and around Toronto. It will unclog a vital artery. Naturally, municipalities near the new hub have concerns, which were clearly communicated to CN during the environmental assessment. So did Indigenous groups and environmentalists. Accommodations were made to the project, and more will be made as the project proceeds. The federal government attached 325 conditions to its approval. Limits will be placed on the number of containers handled per day and on the number of trucks that will visit the terminal. Steps must be taken to protect fish and wildlife. There will be dust and noise abatement measures. Locomotives will be retrofitted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and CN has ordered a fleet of all new electric trucks to service incoming trains. And as $250 million in construction gets underway, CN wants to thank all the stakeholders it's been consulting these past 5 years. The result will be the most environmentally advanced transfer terminal in North America. Now, it's time to get to work. Hey, Jenni, Scott, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. You flying high after last night's game?
Oh, it was a good game. It was a good game. I agree, Scott. I know you messaged that it was a bit sloppy, but after that they really picked it up. So you should text our group that every time they're playing a little bit sloppy. I think that's
so many turnovers in the neutral zone, and I thought, Kerry looked a little weird. He looked a little shaky, but didn't show up on the scoreboard, but it looked a little shaky. So I'm a little worried. I'm going to call him. I think I got some tips. I'm going to talk him to. It's his head, eh? He's always great, but his head sometimes, and I just calm him down. I talk him through it, and I think I've been reluctant to call too early this season, but I feel like I need to chat with him.
So you're at the stage where you're disappointed in 6-2 wins.
Yeah, that's how quickly I've adapted to winning. Let's see what fault we can find with the victory. I'm very happy.
I desperately wanted to wear a Habs shirt today, but I decided not to because after last night, I made a conscious, rational decision. I'm not getting too high early about this. It is very early. Lots could happen. They could regress to the mean, a lot of these young players. So I'm just trying to temper my expectations because it's tempting to start planning the parade.
I have no instinct like that in me. None. Zero. I'm wearing the Habs hat today. I am so miserable and so beaten down by the anvil that is modern life these days that I'm like, I'll take any excuse to be happy. So no way. Like I'm drinking the whole bottle to the bottom. I'm all in. Habs cup. Let's go. I got no like, we better measure this out. None of that impulse whatsoever.
I think there's a difference. I think we can be happy and talk about it, but we cannot become Leafs fans.
You mean in terms of our arrogance?
Yes, and how the first month of the season, it's the parade is planned. So
no.
Right.
I just assumed disaster will occur. That's my working thesis. But I am happy and enjoying it.
I have to say, just on a serious note, that I am, and I was a little suspicious that I wouldn't. I'm finding it a really positive distraction from the crap of life. Oh. I'm enjoying having something on my television other than the minute-by-minute COVID update. And it's good for my mental health. I don't know if it's good for anybody else's, but the hockey season has been good for me.
I agree, 100%.
Benny gets up. My 11-year-old, he gets up and he rolls over in bed. He's like, oh, Dad. I hate online learning so much. I hate online school, Dad. I hate it. And then you'll go, the Habs play tonight? Habs play tonight. Okay, Habs play tonight. And then he gets all excited. So yeah, it's having a material effect on the mental health of my household. Big time.
All right, some politics. We have travel restrictions in Canada now. Serious travel restrictions.
Are they really?
There's some places you can't. Well, I don't know. There's apparently some places, Mexico and the Caribbean, you can't even fly to, and anywhere else you're going to have to get a test and a quarantine when you come back. What do you make of them, Jenni? You're not impressed?
So here's what I'm going to say. There are no travel restrictions. There's the Canadian airlines have agreed with the government to not travel to the Caribbean or Mexico because, of course, of the variant strain. Flights from the UK are still coming in. Three to four flights a day land at Heathrow. So there's no travel restrictions. It's just no Canadian carriers are actually traveling to those countries. In terms of getting a test and quarantining when you come back, there's nothing new about that. That the 14-day quarantine has been in effect since last March or April, and they have required testing since December. A negative PCR test to be able to get on an airplane. So other than adding some seemingly logistical impossible guidelines or rules in, and let's see when they actually come into force, there's nothing really new that they announced last week.
I don't know. I think it's having a discouraging effect. I hear it from people I know, people that are they're snowbirds that were going to fly down for the sun. People that have places in Florida and now are reconsidering whether they go to Florida in February and March. I think tons of people, and we talked about this before, the three of us, tons of people who are thinking about going to March break. I think, that kind of that 24-year-old March break phenomenon, I think they're going to get a world of grief from their parents. That's going to get discouraged. So if the objective of the policy is anxiety about trying to keep whatever percentage of risk you identify with that travel, trying to keep it diminished, I think it's having a psychological impact. I think a lot of people, and some people are like, okay, well, I reluctantly agree to do this. Some people are bitching and moaning. I got a friend who's in Mexico. He's out of his mind, pissed off. I think that little psychological twist of saying you may have to stay, at the Best Western, the Super 8 or whatever for 3 days at your own expense. I find that, like, people, I hear these numbers. People are like, it's 3,000, it's 30,000. It's going to, it seems to have a big psychological conditioning effect on people. At least we'll see what the numbers are, but that's the reaction I'm getting. I think in part this policy is even meant to provoke some outrage, like among that group of people. Like I hear it. So I think it has a discouraging effect.
But I presume that the airlines agreed not to fly to the Caribbean or Mexico because there isn't enough traffic to warrant those flights, and that the reason that they're still flying to Florida and Arizona is because there is enough traffic to still justify those flights. So despite these rules, they must still think it's worth running a plane down to West Palm Beach every day.
Okay, but but to go back to, we're talking about, okay, so there might be a psychological aspect for some people. All I think this has done is basically prevent people that low income and middle class people from flying, because it adds on other restrictions. We've talked about this. If traveling now is seemingly becoming something that only those that have the money to be able to really afford it can do it. And so if what is the purpose alone for psychologically scaring people further than where we're at? If the rationale is to prevent the spread or prevent the variants, then it would have made more sense, as I said, to ban flights from South Africa or the UK, which is where these variants supposedly have started. So if it's psychologically just to scare people, I just think that's a horrible policy, because everywhere else in the world, you have in the U.S. even governments in California and New York are announcing. Cuomo announced that New York City is opening next week for New York City is opening restaurants and what have you. California, Newsom has announced.
But these things seem enormously popular, Jenny. Like, there's a poll out today that says that overwhelmingly Canadians support tougher border restrictions. People are right behind this.
Well, there is no border restrictions. There are no border restrictions. Restrictions.
Okay.
No. This is where
people support the idea of the policy, clearly, right? Like, people are anxious about the variant. They have a, in some cases, misplaced belief that, cases must be flooding in off of planes from foreign destinations. In some, there's a little bit of an underlayer there, an underpinning of, real sort of nativism also about it, right? But people hold these views. And so I think in broad strokes, people are like, I hear about the variant, schools are closed down, life isn't fair. And then I see some people in sunny climes, and now at least that's going to get stopped. And I think, I'm not surprised that it's a popular policy.
So people just want everyone else to be as miserable. Like, it's a horrible. It's like the snitch lines. It's a horrible psychology that people have. But what it did distract from last week was the daily news that the federal government was getting on what was happening on our lack of vaccines. So what that did. So everyone can talk about, they don't want their neighbor to go down to Florida because fuck their neighbor.
So it's good issues management.
Well, it's the issues management of let's just get through the day. So
right.
That's what issues management always is. It's always about getting to the 5 o'clock whistle. Trust me.
No, it's not in all cases. So it took away from that, but I think we're seeing more and more polls out now showing that Canadians are seeing that we are behind. We are behind other countries. We have over the course of the week we have slipped. We are We are the second last G7 country in terms of per capita distribution. The Americans are up to 2 million people a day. They're inoculating, and we're supposedly getting a 70,000, just a 70,000 unit shipment from Pfizer this week, which we were originally supposed to be getting around 400,000. I think it started at 429, and then it decreased to 350, and now we're at 70.
Yeah, we're heading into dry February. Canada's having a dry February. We get no vaccines.
No vaccines.
In the month of February.
I like Pfizer saying,
I suspect
you can get 6 out of that, by the way. You've been mixing your drinks too heavy. You can get 6, not 5 out of that, Canada. And you kind of go like... Those
fuckers, when they first discovered that, they claimed it was a bonus for everybody. Hey, you may even get 6 out of it. Now they claim it's actually intentionally there and you have to get it.
Why are you calling them those fuckers? We have pharmaceutical companies that have made a vaccine in less than a year. The fuckers should be, David. Have the Liberals release the contract.
Come on, lighten up. He's mad at people that are ransoming the fucking vaccines, and we can't be mad about that. What on earth can we be mad about these days?
So I was going to say, I suspect that this will be, if the government believes its own rhetoric, there's better days ahead. But I suspect that February is going to be a very long month for the government.
Yeah.
Yes. And unfortunately, a long month for Canadians.
Because those trends that you're talking about are going to be pretty stark, I think, by the end of February.
Yes.
In terms of UK and the US, at least, being ahead of us.
Well,
I was reading yesterday. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my stated thesis is going to be put to full test, right? Where, I said last week, and I'll just repeat it because I think there's a risk that, I'm going to look super stupid. So I'll remind you guys before you remind me of it. I'm not sure that it's going to be this progression linear thing. Like I think the news is messy. It's dynamic around this stuff. The trend is undeniable. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what level of accountability people demand out of the government, how greatly it affects voters' attitudes toward the government. I continue to believe it's going to be less of a direct impact than you guys think.
Okay, I'll bet you $10 right now.
Okay.
I'll bet you $10 right now that at the end of February, the federal government's disapproval numbers are higher than they are today.
Okay. I'm sure that will be true, but I'll take that bet just for the sake of discussion. I think the real question is, are they outside of majority numbers in Ontario, as an example? Let's use Ontario as ground zero in terms of toughest measures in place, slowest vaccination. And are they below 40% in terms of approval? And I'm betting they'll still be.
I deliberately didn't choose vote intention. I deliberately didn't choose vote intention as my measurement. I chose disapproval because I'm pretty sure disapproval is going to go up. I'm not sure vote intention moves until O'Toole shows some fucking life in that corpse.
But that's my argument. That's my whole argument, right? That's my view is that voter intention for the Liberals will not take a ding. I think that they're still going to sustain a level of support, notwithstanding this. And I'm not sure it's all O'Toole. I mean, he helps. He helps by being over there and talking about how dare the Prime Minister appoint a new GG on his own, like as if like there's more than a dozen people that are fucking wound about that issue like that. To your point, Jenny, about like last week and keeping the focus on vaccines, why he burned a day talking about the Governor General, how the Governor General gets appointed. Like it just seemed to me to be like an absolute fan on the puck. Like I just didn't get it.
Well, and
can I ask you guys a question? We don't want to hang around on vaccines for long. Did you have something you wanted to say, Jenny? Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I have just a broad question about the vaccine issue that I'm really struggling with, which was, why was it ever a good idea for us to pursue a joint venture with the Chinese on vaccination? Given, the feds are announcing domestic production today of the vaccine. And obviously, it's generally considered now that these kinds of things are matters of national security. And people think we should have our own capacity to do it, not even dependent upon the United States or Europe. Much less, why would we ever in this circumstance have thought it was a good idea to do a deal with what is effectively our enemy. They have our people kidnapped over there. Why did we think we should put our vaccine fate in the hands of the Chinese? Is there an answer to this question?
I can't think of one. Listen, I've been talking about this since we started talking about vaccines 8 months ago. I never understood. I never understood that. I never understood that deal at all. Like it makes zero. It makes zero sense to me. Whether it might be as easy as it was an easy decision. I don't know, but I don't know how that is possible. So I can't give an answer for what is probably going to be one of the worst decisions any government in this country has made during the last 10 months.
Can I take a crack? I don't. I mean, I share everybody's, question mark on this thing, but to me, the bigger question is, why didn't they place more bets, more places earlier? Right? Like I think there's a logic where you might say, hey, there's this, we can maybe strike this deal, and you kind of go, well, do we do that with China, knowing that, tensions are so high, they might pull our string, who knows exactly what happens on that? And you go, yeah, you know what? We're in the business of getting any deal we can as fast as we can because we want to make certain that we're as advantaged as possible. So go ahead and do it. That doesn't, so like I could see a logic that takes you like that. I could see that discussion happening. It doesn't explain why not much else happened for a period after that. Like why, like I don't know. It's not that they made a bet on that. It's why didn't they make more bets earlier in addition to that? That's what I don't understand. Did it take them a while before they said, our policy is to spend fucking anything and everything? Like, is that what happened? Like it took them 8 weeks to kind of get their heads around that? I don't know.
Well, and as other countries were ramping up, like the UK and Australia didn't have production capability, and they started actually preparing for that. So now that the UK is getting to a point where they're more self-sufficient, that's why they're not as worried about the EU restrictions coming in terms of the Pfizer vaccines coming in from European countries. And so there was no thought given to that either, and seemingly there were other countries like Mexico and Israel, and Israel is like so far above everyone else in terms of the per capita vaccination rate, and they're participating in post clinical trials or whatever the medical term is. And so there was obviously no thought given to that either, that if we were going to fill a gap where we didn't have full protection capability ourselves, that we would participate in those trials. And so there doesn't seem to have been, up until recently, a lot of thought generally given to anything regarding vaccines.
Right. We were getting trashed on Fareed Zakaria this weekend. Canada was, for being a vaccine hog. We were being cited, along with a few other nations, as countries that had way too much vaccine procured relative to what we needed, and therefore the rest of the world was missing vaccines. So there is a different perspective on this if you're not Canadian.
Well, because that's the talking points of the federal government. They come out every day and say, we have procured more vaccines than any other nation in the country. There'll be 9 vaccines doses for every Canadian. The problem is we don't have them. So
I don't think he's picking up the Canadian government's talking points. I suspect that there is something of a different perspective depending upon where you're coming from.
Well, most of the world has no vaccines, so that's the perspective he was coming from. And if you believe that it doesn't really help to vaccinate only Canada, that you have to actually vaccinate the whole world for this to be effective.
Yeah, the silver lining on that, though, is that Canada will be in a position once we start getting doses. Like, let's assume for the sake of discussion, and not everybody will accept this assumption, that, doses start rolling in March, April, May in large quantities. At that point, the government can say, if not before, based on planning, it can say, we're going to release a shitload of those doses that we've ordered that we know that we will not need, and we'll contribute them to the COVAX facility so that they can be distributed internationally among poor and low-income countries. Like, I think that's a problem that can be remedied once needles start popping into arms. But until we get to that point, you got the problem you got.
And now we'll take a break for a word from one of our sponsors. Founded and headquartered in Canada, Teck has been helping build communities and the economy for over 100 years. They are committed to responsibly providing the metals and minerals needed for the low-carbon future and for building a better quality of life for people around the world. Sustainability is at the core of everything Teck does. That includes working closely with local communities and Indigenous peoples to advance reconciliation, create growth and opportunity, and ensure the benefits of mining are shared. Teck is setting ambitious goals to build on their track record of responsible development, including setting the goal to be carbon neutral across their operations by 2050. Learn how they plan to achieve this and other important initiatives at teck.com/sustainability. That's TECK.com/sustainability. Hey kids, I had Annamie Paul on this show a couple of weeks ago.
I heard that.
And I thought she was really impressive. She was authentic and real and fun and funny and smart and empathetic. I thought she was a lot of good things. Now she's announced that she's running in Ontario. They haven't said what seat in Ontario, but I guess the notable thing is that she's not running in British Columbia, where they have developed a base. Now, I understand what the theory is behind this, because they have obviously big expectations for this election. They want to make a breakthrough. They don't just want to incrementally add a seat or two. They want to become a national party, start displacing the NDP. So they want to act like a national party. And so their belief probably is they can't really be seen as a national party until they're competitive in Ontario, until they play hard in Ontario. So they're going to take the chance that the national campaign goes so well that she gets elected in Ontario and therefore dramatically expands the base of the party. This is the gamble that Brian Mulroney took when he ran in Manickawagan in 1984. This is the gamble that John Turner took when he ran in Vancouver Quadra in 1984. And it worked out for both of them. And there's a Vancouver base for Liberals to this day. But those people had significantly greater stature. And the import of electing either the prime minister or the leader of the opposition was significantly greater than electing Annamie Paul. So I'm not sure it works out for her the same way it worked out for Turner or Mulroney. What do you guys think?
I don't think it does. I think also both Turner and Mulroney had established parties, that had infrastructure across the country. I can see where I understand. I agree with you, David. I can see in their head what they're trying to, what their strategy is. But what you hope for and what is reality are two different things. And so if you look at Elizabeth May, this is the mistake the Greens made. This is the mistake the Greens made after she was elected. She ran in the London North Centre by-election. Then she was bound and determined she was going to go to Central Nova and run against Peter MacKay and lost. And then finally, she ended up running in BC, and that's why they have a beachhead where they are. So I think of Annamie Paul, like the Greens have one seat here in Ontario, Guelph, Shriner provincially. I think if she runs in Toronto Centre again, I think she's going to have the same result and come in second, maybe.
Well,
what if she runs in Guelph?
Well, that's where they have the Greens have their beachhead. So if I'm the Green Party, that's where I'm determined to make it Ontario. Guelph would probably be where I would go.
It must be a good idea. Because all three of us are down on it. Therefore, I don't have a ton to add. I'm with you guys. I just think that the risk-reward gamble doesn't make sense to me, and I think that it runs the risk of forcing them to make a mid-campaign decision to congregate every resource the party has nationally into a single Ontario riding, and still maybe quite likely lose that riding. And I just think that's. It runs the risk that they don't have a breakthrough, that it doesn't provide them with the symbolic and practical breakthrough that they want, and as a consequence, they end up taking a step back, not just in terms of her as leader, but in terms of their growth as a party. Now, we'll look like fools, we'll be proven wrong if the reality is that she goes into the debate and she kicks ass and people go, I want to know more about her, and votes flood her way in Ontario, and it floats more of her green boats in, not just BC, but elsewhere. But I think looking at it from a cost benefit analysis, you would say that this is not a sensible judgment to make on the face of it.
Right. Now, the NDP are talking big. The NDP announced this week that they've paid off their debt and they're raising a lot of money, and they sounded like they wanted to be seen as election ready. They don't want an election, do they?
If I was in the NDP, I wouldn't want an election.
No.
No. It's a nice move.
What would they even? Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be a little bit. Look, it's got to be a little bit of positive news for them. They want to market the fact that they've paid off this debt and show their rank and file that they're taking care of business and and sorting out their house. So I don't begrudge it to them, but they don't want an election. And if they do want an election, then they should be removed from the positions they have in terms of steering the campaign, because it's not a sane thing. It's just not. So,
well, and these are the campaign debts, but they still owe, I believe, I think it's 2 mortgages on the building that they own in downtown Ottawa.
Yeah, they've pumped that thing like an alternative lender for sure.
So.
Yeah, but interest rates are so low.
Hey, you can build NDP bridges right over the building. You can sell a food court in its basement. Now,
we had a fun little glimpse into the inside of the PMO this week with the release of some email correspondence among members of the PMO about the Public Health Agency of Canada. And apparently, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Public Health Agency of Canada, which subsequently has been revealed to have been absolutely a top-notch organization from top to bottom, filled with expertise, that the Public Health Agency of Canada was running rogue and was making decisions and announcing those decisions without informing or consulting the Prime Minister's office. Jenni Byrne, how would you have dealt with that?
Your emails would have looked a little different.
Well, I probably wouldn't have put anything in emails. I think that I probably would have a desk set up at Tenny's Pastures for the duration of the pandemic. I was at Tunney's a lot when we were doing H1N1, and it was not nearly the scope of what this is, but it's a very interesting dynamic. I think that it was evident for the PMO to put that stuff in writing that was a shot across the bow. They did that on purpose, because if you're putting something in writing to a bureaucrat, it's going to be FOI'd. So you're going to know it's going to be ATIP'd, or you have to assume that it's going to be. So a lot of times, I know I'd follow up on messages that I might have delivered verbally, mostly because I wanted it on the record that that's actually what the direction of the center wanted.
I agree with that for sure. That's
Scott, you're the comms director. You wake up in the morning and you read about a policy in the paper.
Okay, so my buddy Mark Mendelson, I think both of you guys know him, right? Former homicide cop, private detective now. Private dick, as I like to say. Mark always tells a story about how when you would put wires on bad guys, unorganized crime guys, that they would wake up in the morning, they'd pick up the phone and they go, "Hey, you fucking cops, I know you're listening. I hope you have a shitty day. Click." And then by 11:30 in the morning, they'd be talking about wild crimes and conspiracies, because human nature is human nature. And you tend to talk, and even when you know rationally, intellectually that you're being monitored, you still can't stop from being you. And so, one, on your point, Jenni, about this may be deliberate because they knew they were going to be ATIP. To be fair to them, many of these communications were between political staff and wouldn't have been subjected to ATIP. They weren't released through ATIP. They were released through that committee deal where they demanded to have it out. So you got a wider berth of stuff, right? So that's not what's typically captured. But going back to my point about, jangling the wires, as Mark would say, I was the guy that was always regretting like ATIP requests and stuff, because they'd come up and I literally had a guy one time come in and go like, "Look, I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to exclude it. We're going to exclude it just on the basis that it's not relevant. But in your email here that's relevant to the request, it finishes with a bunch of curse words and some for no particular reason that we could discern, talk about Sasquatch sightings. So, like, well, I don't know what this is all. So, like, I was the guy that would be like, you know, for fuck's sake, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and just like, I had no filter, right? No filter. When I write an email, I don't sound like I'm composing something. My emails read the way I speak. They did when I was in government, and they would have gotten a much clearer indication of how I think. Now, to the substance of the issue, I think it is intriguing because I think it is an undisguised fact that we know now that they were frustrated with the executional capacity, with the with like the kind of environmental common sense of the people that were running the place. Like, I think they obviously were like, oh my God, right? This is a barrel of monkeys, and they're now in charge of the most important thing we've got going here, and we've got to straighten it out. I think that's the way that those emails read. And you know, that's life in government. Like, we all know this, right? We know that sometimes you're stuck dealing with a department, an agency, a branch of a department that is just like, you know, not doing it, and you wear it, right? And then you get the PM slamming the binder down before a question period saying, well, why should I fucking wear this? Why should I fucking wear this? You know? And it's like, hey, man, you ran for the job.
I remember your frustration with not being able to get Dart off the ground during the tsunami.
I was so angry. This interdepartmental bullshit. Well, we could send water tablets. We don't need to send Dart. That's an inefficient use of resources. We could send water tablets. I'm like, we could send water tablets and the fucking Dart. Okay, come on.
All right, folks, here we are. It's time. It's that time of the show. It's time for Hey You. Who wants to go first? Who's got a Hey You?
I'll go. So for the last 3 Hey Yous, I have focused on either Aaron O'Toole or Doug Ford, and I'm going to actually focus on someone else, or the Liberal government on vaccines, but I think that's too easy. So my Hey You is actually, we were talking about Jagmeet Singh earlier, and the grand pronouncement that they are debt-free. Whatever that means for them, good for them. But let's actually see him start to put his elbows up and start to actually talk about issues that people care about. Because other than that, you haven't really heard him. He's weighed in on stuff going on in the U.S. He retweets American politicians more than he actually talks about Canadian issues. And so I think that if the NDP want to be viable, if they want to go higher, rise higher than where they are in the polls, and start to take on the Liberals, mostly the Liberals. Us, I guess, in some cases, he's going to have to actually start putting forward some actually substantive policies and start holding the government to account. So that's my Hey You.
There you go. Hey You, Jagmeet Singh, who's going to come on the show in a few weeks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Scott.
My Hey You is a continuation of last week's Hey You, but it's more precise. Last week, I blasted about politicians that precondition stuff but don't make announcements. So this week, I'm going to put a red circle around Stephen Lecce, who exactly did that this week. Who, you know, with the deadline for schools reopening, maybe next Wednesday, February 10th, in Toronto and Peel, Stephen Lecce holds a news conference on Monday of this week where he gets up and he announces that he's going to be making an announcement. Then the announcement is that there's going to be student teachers can apply for supply positions, which is an announcement that should have been made like in summer, but anyway, and then refuses to discuss whether or not he's going to do February 10th. After they gave a technical briefing about the conditions that would permit reopening of schools, he won't take an actual question on the subject in the newser. Stop it, man. Stop it. Don't talk about reopenings until you have something to say about reopenings. And, you know, and I'll be frustrated if it comes the day before February 10th, but I'll at least appreciate the integrity of it. Give me one good, clean, I can hang off a message about school reopenings when you have a decision. Don't tell me you're making a decision. Don't tell me, you know what, I've just about finished my porridge, and when I'm done, I'm going to make a decision. Make a fucking decision and tell me. And by the way, I want the schools reopened because I'm cracking, man. I'm starting to crack here. I love my kids, but I love them most when they're in school. You know what I mean? Like,
You sound like you've been talking to my cousin Francie. She's a big fan of the pod and school openings and this. It's mirrored of what you're saying.
I'm a shit parent. I'm just gonna put it like I am a shit parent. I can't do math. I really can't do math in French. My kids are in French immersion. It's a disaster, right? They start reading a French problem, a math problem to me in French, and I'm just like, I want to fall down.
That's why I love working with Scott. He was never able to challenge any of my polling data because he can't do math. So.
Doesn't that mean 43, David? Nope. Oh.
So my hey you goes out to Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister. And my hey you is, listen, I was talking about how much I'm enjoying the hockey season. And it makes me think about what should be the upcoming Canadian Football League season starting in June and July. The CFL cannot play without without a subsidy this year because their entire financial model is based on gate receipts and selling out their stadiums. So there'll be no CFL again this year unless there's some money from government to keep it going. I think it's a huge institution for the country. I think it's very meaningful in Western Canada, and I would really like the government, Chrystia Freeland, when you're putting together your budget, you want to make people in Western Canada feel a little bit better about things. Let the Saskatchewan Roughriders play the Edmonton football team.
Here.
All right. So, mailbag. We put out requests for the mailbag, and we got a ton of responses, So, people, we're not going to get to necessarily your question today, but we are going to keep this inventory and come back to it from time to time. But we're going to do 2 today. And the first one is going to be, I've often wondered why, it's from Jack L. I've often wondered why PM Harper chose to have such a long campaign in 2015. At the midpoint of that campaign, the length of a normal one, the Conservatives held a slender lead in the polls while the Liberals and NDP were basically tied. Do you think, in retrospect, that a shorter campaign might have blunted Trudeau's rise? So I think it's only fair, Jenny, that we go to you first on that.
Yeah, so there was a lot of debate leading into to calling the early election. I don't think it probably would have changed the outcome of the election substantially. Halfway through the campaign, when we would have been starting the campaign, we would have been starting it with the slight lead that we had. Anyways, I don't think it would have changed the ending. Part of the reason we made that determination, as I said, there was a lot of debate in the months leading up to that, is that, working families, PSAC, Engage Canada, they all started running massive ad campaigns against the government. And they were, of course, there was no spending limits on pre-writ advertising. And so one of the calculations we had is by dropping the writ, it meant that there were spending limits on third parties in terms of their advertising, because we weren't sure whether we could we didn't have the resources, the money to respond in kind, and we just felt that we were going to take a huge hit on it. So that was part of the major calculation that we had in terms of calling the writ in August as opposed to September.
When you started that campaign, when you called that campaign, did you think you were running against Mulcair or Trudeau?
I always felt we were running against Trudeau. I think most people in our organization in the party did. I think there were some that felt it was Mulcair, but I never thought that Mulcair was actually our opponent.
I think I agree with that. I don't have much.
Scott, you got anything?
I think I agree with that. That makes sense to me. I guess I'd only say 2 things. I think it makes sense because I think that by the end of the election, we know that election was a change election. And that probably means that it was predestined to be a change election. And there was probably no varying in the outcome. I do wonder if the length of it permitted the organic chemistry of Trudeau to succeed a little bit more than it might have otherwise. Like, I don't know if it meant that he made deeper inroads in BC and Quebec than he might have if he hadn't had an extra couple of weeks. But I can't back up that theory. I'd have to go back and look at the ARCA polling and on regional breakdowns and stuff. But I just wonder if that carried him deeper into some of those places where Liberals didn't have any infrastructure at that point.
I always felt the polls were, and I know we've talked about this before, me coming from the ground side of things, I always felt the polls were not nearly as solid or strong. They were very squishy in terms of what our support was. And so I was watching voter identification numbers come in, and they were getting very bad. So we were identifying a lot of support, but we were identifying a lot of non-supporters, which I've said before. It's like when you start getting more non-supporters in your on a riding than supporters, it's troubling. And I'd never really seen that before. So there were a couple of instances I went out. I was on the plane in August. This is kind of when I started to realize, like, it was kind of mid to late August, that we were starting to squish. So I jumped off the plane because we had some focus groups, and I also wanted to go door knocking. And I went door knocking in James Moore's former riding, one of our better polls. And it was very, like, the response was not good at all. And I did that again in the first week of September in 2 polls in Burlington and Oakville. And it was night and day from even 08 and 11 to what it was. I was picking very good polls, and the response was very bad. And so the polls, it takes a while sometimes, I think, for the polls to catch up. But you really get a sense when you're speaking to people, one-on-one, to get the sense of as to where a party is at.
Yeah. I can't remember the timing of this. Maybe the two of you can help me with the timing of this, because I don't remember it precisely. But I do think that, like all campaigns, that one was changed by events. And the NDP, although they were falling behind the Liberals in English Canada, were stubbornly holding on to their hold in Quebec until the NECAB issue came along and blew them up in the province of Quebec. And the Liberals picked up the splintered shrapnel of the NDP in Quebec and won those seats with it. So, I mean, I always think of how the campaign might have gone, what the result might have been if that hadn't happened and the NDP had a very strong Quebec result still. And
the NECAB wasn't. Most people don't realize this. There was no strategy behind the NECAB debate in terms of it was a court case there was a court hearing halfway through the campaign, and that's what kind of steamrolled everything.
Right. And Mulcair couldn't hold his coalition together under that issue. Okay. Our second mailbag question is really directed at the two of you, because I never worked in the Prime Minister's office. But the question is, what was the worst day you had working in the Prime Minister's office? Scott, what was your worst day? And once you're done, I'm going to ask Paul what his worst day was. See if it's the same.
Well, based on the way you introed it, this may be a cheat, but my worst day in PMO was actually during the 05-06 campaign. It was obvious, right? It wasn't the worst day. It was like a worst days. It was beer and popcorn, man. That was like, look, unless I personally vaccinate 10 million Canadians, my epitaph on my gravestone will read, beer and popcorn, ha, 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 asshole. So, that was it. Like, I mean, it was just a savage thing. And what made that even worse than it was that it wasn't one of those fuck-ups where you go, oh, what are you talking about? I didn't. I went on television. The plane was idling out at the airport. I went and did a hit on Sunday morning CBC TV. I did the hit. I said beer and popcorn. I got out of the studio. I got in my vehicle to drive to the airport, and I was like, I have shit the bed. I have made a big mistake. And I remember calling a team member, Ellie, and saying, I really shit the bed. And he's like, yeah, look, don't worry about it. He was clearly just trying to like spare my suicidal tendency, but it was bad. And then it just got badder and badder for like 4 days. And I wanted to quit. I wanted to throw myself into a volcano. I wanted to walk into the ocean with rocks in my trousers. Like, it was just a terrible, terrible, terrible stretch of time. So that was my worst day, like by a mile. And it was, perfect from my perspective in the sense that it was entirely self-inflicted. I can't blame anybody or anything for it. It was just Scott Reid and his big fucking mouth. That's what caused my problem in my worst day.
Well, I wasn't at the PMO during the 2015 campaign. I had already fully transitioned over to the party. So the 2015 campaign was not a pleasant experience, or parts of it for me on a personal level. No one likes to lead the news or be on the front page of papers, to Scott's point. I think I cut these up. I'm not sure. I put these in two different categories for me. I'd say one of the worst days were always when you get the phone calls in the middle of the night saying that someone had been killed in Afghanistan. The first time I got one in 2006 after we formed government, like my phone was ringing. I had no idea like why. And then they give you the details and you're like, oh, well, that's terrible. Because, the next calls are going to be to this soldier's family. And so I thought those were bad days. And I don't think they ever got easier. In terms of a personal point of view, if you go back to the coalition crisis in 2008, the day that everything kind of came to a head, or the day after everything kind of came to a head, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so I had been going back and forth from PMO, like to center block to the hospital, center block to the hospital, center block to the hospital. And the question period. Harper had a very, I wouldn't say weak question period, but he was obviously rattled, and our caucus was rattled, and our cabinet was rattled, and seeing him rattled in question period made things seem even worse. And so that night was like our staff Christmas party, and I was getting all these calls, and so I remember Guy Giorno and Ray Novak saying, "Don't worry about coming to the Christmas party. Like, just deal with your." And I said, no. We all have to be like, most people don't know what I'm going through. And I think all the senior staff around the PMO, we need to go, and we need to be strong. And that night Harper came onto stage and he got like a 7-minute standing ovation. And that was when everything changed. His mojo, the mojo of the office. The next day, he basically went out and just fucking pounded on the Liberals in question period. And literally we started rallies around the country in terms of the coalition with the separatist Bloc Québécois, but it was that defining moment, that Christmas party that was defining. But the day itself, for like a whole host of reasons, was like probably personally one of the worst I had in the PMO.
Can I add something, David?
Right.
That's a remarkable stretch of time that was. But just, I want to take up the point that Jenni started with, which is separate. I gave you an answer about what was my personal worst day that was linked to my job, but on the responsibilities of the position, just to pick up on that point that Jenni made when she talks about Afghanistan, I'll tell you the worst experience, and maybe the most searing experience I had in government, period. The thing I remember most about. Do
you feel like she made you look shallow? Yeah, well, is this why you're doing this? Do you feel like she made you look like you are super?
No, but in all seriousness, I mean, sometimes in those jobs you get exposed to people dying, right? You get exposed to those kinds of consequences. And I remember when we went into Ampara in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, we were the first foreign government to visit in there, and we walked around the beach where it had hit, and there was this little boy that attached himself to us as a traveling group, and you got the media watching you, and we're walking, doing a tour, and this little boy attached himself to us, and that little boy had no parents, and I can just remember like that just tearing the guts out of me, and the beach was covered in these terracotta shells that looked like terracotta shells, right? And you're like, what is all this? And then being an insensitive dolt, it didn't occur to me that what it was what was remaining of the thatched temporary buildings that had been there, that had housed people. I shouldn't say temporary, the thatched homes that had housed. All that was left was the stuff that was 500 yards inshore that were cinder block buildings. The terracotta were the ceiling tiles that had been left on the shore, and it was. But that little boy who had no parents, and he representing tens of thousands of little boys and little girls. Oh God, it was sickening. So you do get exposed to moments like that when you work for a prime minister, and sometimes they just burn into you, like those phone calls about soldiers and others. So it isn't just about me, Dave.
Although it usually is. Okay, listen. It was so fun to talk to you. Thank you for another great show, and thank you for keeping me sane during these COVID times, for being my friends every week and hanging out with me. So thanks. This was great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Go Habs, go.
Go Habs, go. We'll be back at it next week. See you then.
Hurly burly, hurly burly.